Writer, director and star Branko Tomovic brings us Vampire. This is a somewhat kind of slow-moving, almost but not quite art house vampire movie based in the old country. This is kind of a movie which is filmed and set in Serbia with a kind of a largely kind of Serbian cast. And before I go any further, I will say this review will be mildly spoilery. I'm not going to out kind of major kind of plot point to exactly what happens, but I do have to mention a couple of things for me to really critique this movie. But before that, let me give you a brief plot synopsis. It focuses on this guy who essentially is running away from his old life and decides he's going to take a job in deepest, darkest Serbia as a kind of caretaker of this cemetery, which is kind of run down. And he can't even speak Serbian, but he kind of goes there in this very remote village and is feeling somewhat of a kind of a stranger in a strange land. The locals seem to be a little bit weird towards him, to say the least. I mean, they seem somewhat friendly in some respects. They seem to always kind of be bringing him food, but they also seem to treat him somewhat as an outsider and kind of keeping their distance. We also get a number of kind of supernatural events that start happening. Now, based on the actual title of the movie, you kind of know where this movie is going to go. But, you know, initially it seems to be some more subtle kind of supernatural stuff. And it's a sense of paranoia and unease that this character is kind of feeling, not quite what's going on. And ultimately, we find there is a presence there which may has malicious intent. Okay, so let's talk about what I think worked in this movie. So this feels very much not like a kind of like a Hollywood production. It's very much has its kind of its sights set on atmosphere and mood rather than kind of like shock or schlock storytelling. And I gotta say, I think for the most part here, this movie succeeds in creating a somewhat kind of eerie and almost disturbing kind of atmosphere. You know, this movie being set and kind of obviously filmed in kind of Serbia, it has this rustic, rural feel where we feel like we're dealing with like the old country, you know, and these kind of like these myths and legends that have kind of come from this this part of the world where people are still kind of living a somewhat kind of simple life. And, you know, kind of don't take too kindly to kind of strangers and things like this. So it does have this feeling of this somewhat of an oppressiveness and somewhat of a kind of like, you know, these villagers are keeping this kind of guy at an arm's length, and I think the movie does a good job of making you feel this unease that this character would be feeling, because he feels like, you know, he's not particularly kind of welcome there. He feels like certainly somewhat ostracized and is really feeling kind of cut off and lonely and kind of like doesn't really know what he's going to kind of do. And the movie does a good job of portraying that. The movie's kind of paranormal side of stuff is somewhat kind of subtle at first, but as the film goes on, we do get some more overt stuff kind of happening. I won't say too much, but you know, there's a couple of kind of creepy moments that aren't going to make you jump. They're not going to jump scares. They're not kind of like big set pieces, anything like that. But it does a good job of, I think, creating this feeling of unease where you're not quite sure what's kind of going on, because it's not typically of what you've seen in a vampire film. And I would say this movie kind of takes a different path, where it's more telling you about the effects of a vampire, how it affects the kind of like the community, the people around it, and kind of like what's happening because of the vampire rather than about a vampire, if that makes sense. So it's an interesting kind of idea here. It's also very well filmed. I think there's a great use of location shooting here. Again, it's kind of getting away from that kind of artificial kind of set, kind of style production that you would have seen like in a lot of American movies, for example. Filming a lot in the kind of the open kind of spaces and these kind of like rustic kind of like buildings that you know, kind of fall into part to a certain degree. Casting what looks like kind of like local kind of people who in the nicest possible way seem kind of like somewhat weathered, shall we say. You know, and I quite like that kind of feeling of this. This is, you know, these are kind of like realistic, you know, people who you might see out there, kind of who lives in the sticks and things like that. And I quite like the way that it's somewhat ambiguous as to what their kind of like their goal is. Are they kind of friendly or are they not? You know, obviously all will be revealed as the kind of the film goes on. And as I say, I'm going to give you some mild spoilers in just a moment. But I kind of quite like that, and it's very well filmed as well. You know, you have these kind of quite nice cinematography, some kind of quite beautiful shots, I have to say. So let me transition to maybe what doesn't work here. Now, this is a slow film. It's, as I say, not quite an art house film, but it has some kind of art house sensibilities, I would say. There is not a lot of dialogue in this film. There's long spaces where you don't have a conversation with another character. Part of the reason for that is our central character only speaks English, and everyone else, you know, outside of maybe two other characters, only ever speaks Serbian. So he doesn't really have a lot of interaction with people. So we get a lot of use of assumptions about what's kind of going on rather than kind of spelling things out for you through kind of dialogue and stuff like that. But the story is relatively kind of slight. I'll come onto it again. Now, this movie, I think, is trying to be a very atmospheric movie. It's trying to be a movie which is really kind of a mood movie, if that makes sense. It's trying to kind of instill this kind of like this mood, this kind of macabre mood, which I think it succeeds on. But I don't think it's a particularly gripping story, nor do I think it's a particularly kind of a realistic story in a way. Now, I know this movie's about vampires, so you can obviously say, well, that's not realistic, but that's not what I mean. Let me give you some examples of kind of why this movie never really kind of, I felt like particularly kind of engaged with this kind of character, for example. Number one, I think the reasons why he goes to Serbia are a little flimsy. It's one kind of like conversation that he has with a character about the reasons why he's there, and it's like, well, why go to a country where you can't even speak the language? Why such a remote area? How did you get, you know, how did you end up in this particular kind of place? Because there's not even phone reception. It's like, how have you got there? It seems like we just needed an excuse to have this character here. And I felt like that was a little kind of shortchanged. He's also the most unreactive kind of character you'll ever see. For example, there's a scene where and this is one of the earlier signs that there's something kind of maybe paranormal kind of going on. He goes to the local shop to buy some food, and he buys some eggs, bread, and some meat. And when he takes it back to his house, everything spoils straight away. The meat's got maggots in it. The bread is all kind of like mouldy and the eggs are all kind of gone off. But he's like, doesn't even go, what the hell, you know. But there's nothing, there's just no reaction to it. Just like, oh, doesn't say anything, he just kind of looks at it. And that's just an example. There's this, like, he just seems particularly kind of unreactive to stuff. Now, so for those of you who maybe live in the UK, he reminds me a little bit of a very non-talkative Carl Pilkington, if that makes sense. If you can imagine Carl Pilkington without the constant kind of like whinging and moaning, he just kind of is like that. He's like this guy who just seems to potter around a little bit and kind of doesn't really seem that he knows what he's doing. Like he's going to there to be a caretaker, but we see him one time kind of like picking like rubbish out the cemetery wearing like a little tight-fitting black shirt, and I'm thinking, you're meant to be a caretaker? And just like, oh my God. You know, and it relies a little bit too much on kind of dreams and premonitions as well. This movie has a lot of kind of dream sequences, and I think it plays that hand a little bit too much, if I'm completely honest. Again, I don't want to avoid particularly kind of spoilers. How can I put this? I didn't really understand. Okay, so when the vampire is revealed, let me say this. It transpires about the villagers' kind of relationship to it, and I didn't really understand why they didn't seem to. They almost seem to be providing for it, but I don't know why. In the movie, never really kind of tells you why it is that they are doing this. It's obviously vampires are killing people. That's what they do. But these villagers seem to be quite content in kind of like helping it out. But there's no reason on screen about why they're doing it. I mean, I guess you don't need to have movies explain everything for you. But it just seems like there's maybe like a cult, but it's so. There's nothing. There's no information about it. You're just led to go. Oh, it just is. And then we kind of get to this. When we get a vampire turns up in the movie, and we see someone transition from human to a vampire, they're kind of they seem completely cognizant, but their priorities change and their kind of like point of view. Maybe their allegiances change. You think, well, but why? You think this character seems to be able to kind of have, reasoning skills, but why is it now seeming to kind of align itself with someone who it wasn't aligned with before? Again, trying to be vague here. It just happened. It was like, oh, we just got to accept it. It's just kind of there. And it's like the same thing with this, of the reasons why he's kind of, this guy initially is coming to Serbia. And it's like, well, he's running away from something ultimately, but why rural Serbia? Why not pick an English-speaking language country if you're running away? It just seems like a real flimsy kind of reason for him to go to this place specifically. Again, it just seems that this movie has like, this is the one director, one writer, one star. He's the man in charge. He wants it his way. When I feel like this movie, it just has some questions that just seem to be hanging over it, if that makes sense. Now, you might not care. You might say, "Oh well," but I enjoy the mood and I enjoy the kind of the atmosphere that this movie provides, and it does do that well. But it's not a particularly kind of gripping storyline, I have to say. Again, I don't want to spoil anything too much for you, but it just seems to be that this guy he seems to be wandering around, not really kind of saying anything, even to himself, and he's not really reacting like a kind of a realistic kind of person. And as such, it's hard to kind of root for this character, even though I think the movie does a good job of kind of making you have this feeling of unease that would be put upon him. I think it wastes that kind of that setup by having a character who seems very away with the fairies, is the best way I could describe it. He just doesn't seem to be kind of like tethered to reality in any kind of meaningful way. I mean, I guess it's just some quiet, dreamy guy who never really reacts to anything. I guess that's the kind of like, just maybe the guy he is, and like, yeah, we just don't question why these characters are doing these things. We just got to accept it. That's the way it goes. So this movie, I think, does a good job of creating a nice atmosphere. A kind of like a spooky, kind of eerie atmosphere. But narratively, I felt this movie is quite weak. And because of that, it's not really a gripping story. I don't think you can particularly kind of enjoy it as a thrilling narrative, even though I think the movie's not necessarily trying to be thrilling, but at least a compelling narrative. Because this movie is not compelling, in my opinion, in its narrative state. Visually, I think it does well, but that's not what it's all about. It's everything. I've got to say, to me, as a film, a compelling story is probably the most important thing. And even though I like some of the artistic sensibilities of this movie, because it fails a little bit on the narrative side, I've got to give it a below average mark, but it's not a terrible movie because I do think it has some elements that are interesting. So I'll give it a 4 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to you next time. Bye for now.